My daughter stood up at her wedding, pointed at me in front of 200 guests, and said I was the reason she had a miserable childhood. The house she grew up in, the college degree she earned, and even the wedding venue itself had all been paid for by me. I was sitting at the front table when she said it, close enough to see the little shake in her hand around the champagne glass, close enough to see her new husband glance at her like he had been waiting for that exact moment. Everyone laughed at first because they thought it was a joke. Then they realized it wasn't. The room went quiet in that strange way rooms do when people are suddenly afraid to breathe too loudly. My daughter, Emily, looked beautiful that day. I wish I could separate that from what happened, but I can't. She had her mother's eyes, the same pale green that looked soft when she was happy and sharp when she wanted to win. Her dress cost more than my first pickup truck. The flowers alone cost enough to pay one of my crews for a week. I knew that because I had paid for them. I had paid for almost all of it. The lakefront venue, the catering, the photographer, the string quartet she insisted would make the ceremony feel timeless, the custom invitations with gold edging, the ridiculous champagne tower that I told her nobody needed and she told me everyone would remember. She was right about that part. People remembered. They just didn't remember it for the reason she thought they would. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 64 years old, and for 38 years I ran Bennett Commercial Construction out of a brick office on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing glamorous. We built warehouses, medical offices, retail shells, and the kind of industrial spaces people drive past without ever wondering who poured the slab or framed the walls. I started with one truck, 2 borrowed ladders, and a line of credit I had no business getting approved for. By the time my daughter got married, I had 72 employees, 3 project managers, and enough contracts booked out that most men my age would have been comfortable slowing down. I was not most men. Work was the language I understood best. After my wife died, it became the only language I trusted. Emily was 12 when Caroline passed. Ovarian cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to funeral. I can still remember Emily sitting in the back seat of my truck after the service, wearing a black dress Caroline's sister had bought for her, staring out the window while everyone else stood around the church parking lot holding paper plates of sandwiches nobody wanted. I had no idea what to say to her. I could negotiate with suppliers, handle lawsuits, fire unreliable subcontractors, and walk into a failing project and see exactly where things had gone wrong. But I did not know how to explain to a 12-year-old girl that her mother was gone and the world was still somehow expecting us to go home, eat dinner, and wake up the next morning. So I did what a lot of men do when they are terrified of emotional failure. I solved the problems I could touch. I kept the house spotless. I made sure she had clothes, tutors, summer camps, birthday parties, driving lessons, college applications, a safe car, a better apartment than any 22-year-old needed, and eventually a position at my company that she had not earned but I convinced myself she would grow into. I told myself I was being a good father. Maybe part of me was. But another part of me was paying off a debt no one had asked me to repay. I had missed school plays because concrete trucks arrived late. I had missed parent-teacher conferences because a client changed specs at the last minute. Caroline had been the soft place in Emily's life, and when she died, I tried to replace softness with resources. Every time Emily was unhappy, I bought her comfort. Every time she struggled, I removed the obstacle. Every time she wanted something, I told myself no was a word she had heard enough from life already. That sounds noble until you see where it leads. For a long time, Emily seemed grateful. She was smart, charming when she wanted to be, and ambitious in a way that made people lean toward her when she spoke. She graduated with a marketing degree and came to work for me at 24. At first, she handled client presentations and branding material. She was good at making our company look more polished than it had ever looked. She redesigned the website, cleaned up our proposals, convinced me to stop using photos taken on job sites with someone's thumb half covering the lens. I gave her credit for that. I still do. But over the years, her title grew faster than her responsibility. Marketing coordinator became director of client strategy. Director became vice president of development. The salary went up. The company card limit went up. Her sense of ownership went up with it. Then she met Brandon. Brandon Vale walked into our office one Thursday afternoon wearing a navy suit, brown leather shoes, and the kind of smile that made people feel like they were either being admired or measured. He worked in commercial lending then, or at least that was how Emily introduced him. He understands growth, she told me after their third date, as if growth was a personality trait. He was polite to me in the beginning. Called me Mr. Bennett even after I told him Richard was fine. Asked questions about the company. Complimented the business. Said things like, "You built something incredible here," in a tone that should have made me proud. Instead, it made me cautious, though not cautious enough. There was something in the way he looked around my office the first time Emily brought him by. Not curious. Not impressed. Appraising. Like he was already calculating the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to sit. They dated for 2 years before the engagement. By then, Brandon had left banking and started calling himself a strategic advisor, which seemed to mean he took long lunches with men who liked hearing themselves talk about private equity. Emily began repeating phrases I had never heard from her before. Legacy transition. Modern leadership. Founder bottleneck. Generational repositioning. The first time she said my leadership style was operationally outdated, I laughed because I thought she was teasing me. She wasn't. She had started to see me less as her father and more as a man standing in the doorway of something she believed already belonged to her. The wedding planning made it worse. Caroline would have known how to handle it. She would have found the right balance between generosity and spine. I had the generosity part. The spine came late. Emily wanted a venue overlooking the lake. I paid the deposit. She wanted imported flowers. I grumbled, then paid. She wanted a separate cocktail lounge because Brandon's friends expected a certain experience. I asked what that meant. She said, "Dad, please don't make everything about money." That was when I should have stopped. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because the person asking me not to make everything about money was asking me to spend more of mine. The week before the wedding, Emily called me and asked if I would keep my speech short. I had been working on it for days. Nothing fancy. A few memories of her as a little girl, something about Caroline, something about how proud I was. I told her it would only be 5 minutes. She hesitated, then said, "Maybe skip the sad mom stuff. I don't want the night to feel heavy." I sat at my kitchen table with the speech in front of me and looked at the paragraph about Caroline teaching Emily to ride a bike in the driveway. I said, "Your mother is not heavy, Emily." She sighed like I was being difficult. "I know that. I just want the night to feel like us." I didn't ask who us meant. I already had a feeling I wasn't included in it. Still, I showed up early on the wedding day. I wore the charcoal suit Emily had picked because she said my old one looked too businesslike. I shook Brandon's father's hand. I smiled for photos. I walked my daughter down the aisle while she held my arm lightly, almost politely, like I was an usher helping her find her seat. During the ceremony, I looked at the empty chair in the front row where Caroline would have sat, and I told myself grief does strange things on important days. It makes small slights feel enormous. It makes you hear things that may not be there. So when Emily barely looked at me after the ceremony, I ignored it. When Brandon's friends kept calling me the founder instead of her father, I ignored that too. When I saw my company's biggest client sitting at a table with Brandon's former banking colleagues, even though I had never approved business invitations for the wedding, I pushed the thought aside and told myself not today. Then came the speeches. Brandon went first. Smooth, practiced, full of jokes about how Emily had big dreams and refused to settle for small-town thinking, which was funny considering my small-town thinking had paid for the champagne in his hand. His father spoke next and said Brandon had married into a family with tremendous opportunity. Not love. Not warmth. Opportunity. I remember that word clearly because it landed wrong in my chest. Then Emily stood up. She smiled at the room, thanked everyone for coming, thanked the vendors by name, thanked Brandon's parents for believing in our future, and then her eyes found me. I know people think I had everything growing up, she said. But money doesn't make a childhood happy. A few people made soft sympathetic sounds. I felt my hands go still in my lap. She kept going. My dad gave me things, but he was never really there. And honestly, for a long time, I thought that was love. I thought love was a check, or a house, or a job title. But Brandon taught me that love is being seen. The photographer lowered his camera. Emily lifted her glass slightly in my direction. So I guess I should thank my father for showing me exactly what I didn't want in a marriage. No one laughed that time. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had raised alone, the woman whose life I had built scaffolding around for 20 years, and I felt something inside me go very quiet. Not broken. Not yet. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a building shifts and every experienced man on site knows to step back. I did not stand up. I did not interrupt her. I did not make a scene. I sat there while she finished her speech and the room forced out nervous applause because people will clap for almost anything if silence feels more dangerous. Brandon kissed her temple like she had done something brave. I folded my napkin, placed it beside my untouched dinner, and understood, with terrible clarity, that my daughter had not humiliated me by accident. She had done it in front of witnesses. And 3 days later, when Brandon called asking me to sign preliminary paperwork for what he called the next chapter of Bennett construction, I finally understood the wedding speech had only been the opening move. I didn't leave immediately after the speech. Most people assume I did when they hear the story. They imagine me standing up, knocking over a chair, marching toward the exit while guests stare into their wine glasses. Real life is rarely that dramatic. Most humiliations happen in slow motion. You stay seated because your brain needs time to catch up to what just happened. You smile because years of social conditioning kick in before your emotions do. You convince yourself there must be context you're missing. Some explanation that will make everything feel less intentional. So I sat there. The band started playing again. Servers appeared carrying plates nobody seemed interested in eating. Conversations resumed around the room, but not naturally. The atmosphere felt strained. People were speaking a little too loudly, laughing a little too hard, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a daughter publicly blame her father for her childhood during a wedding reception he had largely financed. A few guests approached my table. Most didn't know what to say. One older woman squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Children can be complicated." I thanked her. Another guest, someone from Brandon's side of the family, told me Emily was just speaking her truth. Speaking your truth has become a convenient way to avoid responsibility for being cruel. The truth is not automatically noble simply because someone feels it strongly. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Then I quietly left. I drove home alone. The highway was mostly empty by then. Summer rain tapped lightly against the windshield. The reception venue sat about 40 minutes outside Columbus, and I spent that entire drive replaying the speech in my head. When I got home, I took off the suit, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, and sat in the dark living room. Caroline's picture still stood on the bookshelf beside the fireplace. Same silver frame. Same photograph from a vacation we took in Maine nearly 20 years earlier. I looked at her smile and found myself asking a question I hadn't asked in a long time. What would she have seen that I missed? Because there had been signs. Looking back, there are always signs. The problem is that when you're emotionally invested in someone, you become remarkably skilled at explaining those signs away. I thought about Emily's first year at the company. Back then she genuinely wanted to learn. She followed project managers around construction sites. The employees liked her. Not because she was the owner's daughter. Because she worked. Then things began changing gradually. She stopped asking questions and started giving instructions. Started talking about authority before demonstrating competence. At first I assumed it was immaturity. Then I assumed it was confidence. Eventually I stopped examining it altogether. Around the same time Brandon became more involved. Not officially. He never worked for the company. But he was always around. He seemed fascinated by subjects most young men avoid. One afternoon about a year before the wedding, he joined Emily and me for dinner. We were discussing an industrial development project outside Dayton. The conversation had nothing to do with succession. Nothing to do with ownership. Yet somehow Brandon found his way there. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Have you ever thought about stepping away and letting Emily run things completely?" I laughed. Not because the idea was impossible. Because it felt premature. I said, "Eventually." He nodded thoughtfully. Eventually can sneak up on people. At the time I brushed it off. Now I remember it differently. Because that wasn't curiosity. That was reconnaissance. Over the next year, similar conversations kept appearing. The way they framed it, you'd think I was a stubborn relic refusing to embrace progress. The reality was that the company had experienced its 3 most profitable years under my leadership. Yet they spoke as though a transformation was urgently needed. I understand now that they weren't evaluating performance. They were evaluating timing. The wedding accelerated everything. About 2 months before the ceremony, Emily asked if we could have lunch. Just the 2 of us. I remember feeling pleased about that. Our relationship had become increasingly business-oriented. Less father and daughter. More executive and executive. I thought maybe she wanted to reconnect. Instead she spent most of lunch discussing leadership transition. At one point she said, "Don't you ever want to enjoy life instead of working all the time?" I said I enjoyed work. She smiled sympathetically. The way people smile when they think you're lying to yourself. Maybe you only think you do because it's all you've ever known. I remember staring at her for a moment. There was something unsettling about hearing your own child explain your life to you. Especially when they're explaining a version that doesn't match reality. The conversation moved on. I forgot about it. Or maybe I chose to forget. The wedding speech forced me to revisit everything. Suddenly those little moments connected. Like scattered puzzle pieces finally forming a picture. The next morning I arrived at the office before sunrise. I unlocked my office and started going through emails. Not because I was suspicious. Not yet. Because work has always been where I go when life becomes confusing. Contracts don't lie to you. People sometimes do. Around 9 o'clock, my executive assistant, Sandra, knocked on the door. Sandra had worked for me 22 years. Long enough to tell when something was wrong. She closed the door behind her. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged. "I've been worse." She nodded. Then she hesitated. That caught my attention. Sandra wasn't someone who hesitated. "What is it?" I asked. She looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable people become when they possess information they'd rather not be carrying. Finally she said, "Richard, there's something I think you should know." A strange feeling settled into my stomach. I set down my coffee. Sandra took a breath. "Several clients called this morning asking about the transition." "The transition?" She nodded. "The leadership transition." I stared at her. For a second I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. "What leadership transition?" Sandra looked confused. She slowly sat down across from my desk. "Richard, people think you're retiring." The room suddenly felt very still. I asked her where they heard that. She told me multiple clients had congratulated Emily during the wedding. Several believed ownership changes were already underway. One supplier apparently thought Emily would become CEO before the end of the year. Another believed Brandon was joining senior management. I felt my pulse quicken. And for the first time since the wedding, a realization began taking shape. The speech hadn't been the destination. It had been preparation. A public narrative. A way to position me as the outdated father who needed to step aside so the next generation could finally take over. And sitting in my office that morning, listening to Sandra describe conversations happening behind my back, I began to suspect that my daughter and her husband weren't simply rewriting our family history. They might already be trying to rewrite the future of my company too. For the next few days, I didn't confront Emily. I didn't confront Brandon either. One advantage of spending nearly 4 decades in construction is that you learn the difference between suspicion and evidence. Suspicion tells you where to look. Evidence tells you whether you're wasting your time. So I looked. The first thing I noticed was how relaxed Emily seemed after the wedding. If she regretted what she had said, she hid it remarkably well. There were no apologetic texts. No uncomfortable phone calls. No attempt to explain herself. In fact, it was almost the opposite. She behaved as though something important had finally been settled. 2 days after the reception, she stopped by the office. She walked through the building greeting employees with unusual confidence, carrying herself less like an executive and more like an owner. I watched her through the glass wall of a conference room while I was reviewing bids with one of our project managers. Several employees gathered around her. Every conversation seemed to end with Emily saying some variation of the same phrase. "Big changes are coming." At first I thought I was imagining it. Especially considering nobody had discussed any changes with me. Later that afternoon I called Sandra into my office. "Pull together every organizational chart we've used in the last 18 months. She looked confused but nodded. By the next morning I had a stack of internal documents sitting on my desk. Nothing unusual. Until I reached a presentation Emily had created 6 months earlier for a leadership retreat. Halfway through the deck, I found a slide titled, "The Future Leadership Vision." My name appeared near the bottom. The chart showed Emily as CEO. A position that did not exist. Brandon appeared beside her as strategic advisor. A role that also did not exist. My position had been labeled founder emeritus. I stared at that slide for a long time. Founder emeritus. A decorative title. The corporate equivalent of being handed a gold watch and quietly escorted toward the exit. I checked the date. The presentation had been created 8 months before the wedding. That meant the idea wasn't new. The narrative had been developing long before Emily stood up with a champagne glass and told 200 people I had failed her. The speech wasn't spontaneous. It was part of something larger. That realization settled heavily in my mind. Over the following week more pieces surfaced. One afternoon I had lunch with Tom Reynolds, a developer I'd worked with for nearly 20 years. Tom wasn't the type to gossip. Which made his comment more significant. Halfway through lunch he asked, "So when are you actually stepping down?" I nearly laughed. Instead I asked where he had heard that. Tom shrugged. "Brandon mentioned it at a fundraiser a couple months ago. Said you were preparing a transition plan." I felt my jaw tighten. Tom continued talking, unaware of what he had just revealed. Apparently Brandon had been discussing future expansion strategies. He spoke as though he already had authority. As though the future had already been assigned. By the time lunch ended, I wasn't angry. Anger had begun transforming into curiosity. Questions eventually uncover answers. The answers arrived faster than I expected. 3 days later Sandra knocked on my office door again. This time she looked genuinely nervous. She closed the door behind her. "Richard, I think you should see this." She handed me a printed email. The message had originally been sent by Emily to a private group of department heads. Most of the content was ordinary. Then I reached the final paragraph. My eyes stopped moving. For a moment I simply stared. The paragraph read, "As we continue preparing for the next phase of company leadership, Brandon and I appreciate everyone's support and discretion. Official announcements will be made once the transition timeline is finalized." I looked up at Sandra. "When was this sent?" 4 months ago. 4 months. An entire internal narrative had been operating inside my company without my knowledge. Not everyone knew. But enough people did. The following Friday brought the first direct confrontation. I arrived at the office later than usual after visiting a project site outside the city. As I walked past conference room B, I heard voices inside. The door wasn't fully closed. I recognized Emily immediately. Then Brandon. I paused. Not to eavesdrop. At least that wasn't my intention. But then I heard my name. So I stopped. Brandon was speaking. "He won't do it voluntarily." Emily sighed. "What choice does he have eventually? He still thinks the company is his." A brief silence followed. Then Brandon laughed softly. "Perception matters more than paperwork. Particularly from a man who had never built anything himself." Emily spoke next. "I just don't want a fight." Brandon replied immediately. "There won't be one." The certainty in his voice bothered me more than anything else. I quietly walked away before either of them noticed me. Then I spent the next hour sitting alone in my office thinking. Construction teaches another useful lesson. When a building develops cracks, inexperienced people focus on the crack itself. Experienced people look underneath. Because cracks aren't usually the problem. They're symptoms. The real problem is deeper. Stress accumulating where nobody can see it. The wedding speech had been a crack. What I was discovering now was the foundation beneath it. Emily no longer viewed herself as my daughter working inside a company. She viewed herself as the rightful successor waiting for paperwork to catch up with reality. Brandon viewed me as a temporary obstacle. When people receive something they haven't earned, gratitude fades quickly. Entitlement takes its place. That evening I stayed at the office long after everyone left. Outside my window, the city lights flickered across the horizon. For nearly 40 years I had believed I was building something that would eventually support my family. Now I was beginning to wonder whether I had accidentally built something else. Around 9 o'clock my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "Hey Dad. Brandon and I wanted to stop by Sunday. We have some exciting plans to share with you." I stared at the message. Then I smiled. Because for the first time, I had a fairly good idea what those plans might be. And for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer walking into the conversation blind. Sunday arrived exactly on schedule. Emily and Brandon pulled into my driveway just after noon. I watched them through the front window while pretending to read a report at the kitchen table. Emily carried a bakery box. Brandon carried a leather portfolio. That combination told me almost everything I needed to know. The bakery box was for appearances. The portfolio was the reason they were there. When I opened the door, Emily kissed my cheek as though nothing unusual had happened over the previous 2 weeks. No mention of the wedding speech. No acknowledgement of the rumors spreading through the company. No apology. Just a cheerful smile and a box of pastries she probably picked up 20 minutes earlier. Brandon was equally relaxed. Confident people often reveal more through comfort than arrogance. He shook my hand and said, Good to see you, Richard. We sat at the kitchen table. Funny how places remain constant while the people around them change. For the first 15 minutes they talked about ordinary things. The honeymoon. The weather. A new restaurant downtown. Then Brandon opened the portfolio. Several neatly organized documents appeared on the table. At first glance it looked like a business presentation. At second glance it looked like an attempted takeover. Emily leaned forward excitedly. We've been working on a vision for the future. I nodded. Have you? She didn't catch the edge in my voice. Or maybe she chose not to. Brandon slid the first document toward me. Across the top were the words. Bennett Construction Leadership Transition Plan. I didn't touch it. I simply looked at the cover page. Then at them. Then back at the document. Neither seemed nervous. That fascinated me. These two behaved as though the outcome was already agreed upon. Emily began explaining. The company had reached a crossroads. A new generation was needed. Fresh ideas. Modern leadership. Expanded growth opportunities. I had heard variations of the same speech for nearly 2 years. The difference was that this time they had put it in writing. According to their plan, would gradually reduce operational involvement over the next 6 months. Emily would assume CEO responsibilities. Brandon would oversee strategic development initiatives. Eventually ownership restructuring would occur. I listened without interrupting. One lesson age teaches is that people reveal more when they think you're agreeing with them. The presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, neither Emily nor Brandon asked what I wanted. Not once. Everything centered around what they had planned. My role consisted largely of cooperating. When they finally finished, silence settled over the room. Emily smiled. So what do you think? I folded my hands. I think it's very thorough. She looked pleased. Brandon looked relieved. Then I added, who authorized this? The mood changed instantly. Emily blinked. What do you mean? I mean, who authorized a leadership transition plan for a company you don't own? Her smile faded. Brandon jumped in. We're just planning ahead. I nodded. For whom? Nobody answered immediately. Finally Emily spoke. Dad, this isn't about ownership. I almost laughed. Of course it was about ownership. Everything had been about ownership. Every road led to the same destination. I pushed the documents back across the table. Then I said something neither of them expected. I've already spoken with my attorneys. The silence that followed felt different. Sharper. Brandon's expression changed first. Emily looked confused. I continued. I've spent the last few weeks reviewing company governance, ownership structures, succession planning, voting rights, trust arrangements, and beneficiary designations. Nobody spoke. I could almost hear their expectations rearranging themselves. Brandon recovered first. Why would you do that? That question told me everything. Because in his mind, there had been no reason for me to review anything. The future was already decided. At least according to him. I smiled slightly. The same reason anyone reviews important assets when they discover other people are making plans for them. Emily shifted in her chair. You're overreacting. I looked at my daughter. For a moment I saw the 12-year-old girl who lost her mother. Then I saw the woman sitting across from me. The woman who stood in front of 200 guests and used my dead wife's memory as a weapon. The woman who had spent months preparing a future she never bothered discussing with the person most affected by it. Am I? I asked quietly. She looked away. That was the first time all afternoon she broke eye contact. The conversation deteriorated from there. Brandon became increasingly defensive. Emily became increasingly emotional. I remained calm. That frustrated them more than anger would have. Eventually Brandon stopped pretending. He leaned forward and said, "Richard, with all due respect, succession is inevitable." I nodded. Death is inevitable too. That doesn't mean I hand over my house tomorrow. His jaw tightened. Emily sighed heavily. "Dad, why are you making this difficult?" I stared at her. That sentence may have been the most revealing moment of the entire conversation. The meeting ended awkwardly. Neither got what they came for. As their car disappeared down the street, I walked back inside and sat alone at the kitchen table. The documents remained exactly where they had left them. The next morning I met with my attorney. A week later I met with my accountant. Then a trust specialist. Then a corporate governance advisor. I didn't move quickly. I moved carefully. There is a difference. By the end of the month, several things had changed. Voting control was protected. Ownership structures were updated. Trust arrangements were revised. Key executives were informed privately. Emergency succession protocols were rewritten. After all, Brandon had been right about one thing. Perception matters. But paperwork matters too. Particularly when millions of dollars and 40 years of work are involved. 2 weeks later the consequences arrived. Emily called me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The moment I answered, I knew something had happened. Her voice sounded different. "Dad." I leaned back in my chair. "What is it?" There was a long pause. Then she said something I had been waiting weeks to hear. "Why are people saying ownership changes aren't happening anymore?" I looked out the window toward the city lights beyond my backyard. For the first time since the wedding, I felt strangely peaceful. Because after months of being the last person informed about my own future, I was finally the first person holding the truth. And Emily was about to learn that assumptions can be very expensive. I didn't answer Emily's question immediately. Sometimes silence does more work than words. On the other end of the line, I could hear her breathing. Not angry breathing. Nervous breathing. There is a difference. Anger pushes forward. Nervousness waits for what comes next. Finally I said, "Because ownership changes aren't happening." Then she asked, "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. "What part of that sentence is confusing?" Her voice sharpened. "Dad, people are telling me plans have been cancelled." I told her we could discuss it in person if she wanted. She arrived the following afternoon. For the first time in months, she looked tired. We sat in my office. The same office where she had spent years imagining her future. She got straight to the point. "What did you do?" I explained. "Not everything. Just enough." The more I spoke, the paler she became. Eventually she interrupted. "You changed everything?" "No." I shook my head. "I clarified everything." That distinction mattered too. Because the company had always belonged to me. I wasn't taking something away. I was preventing something from being taken. Emily stared at the floor. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "You don't trust me." I thought carefully before answering. "Trust isn't something you inherit." Her eyes met mine. I continued. "Trust is built." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she stood up and left. Over the next few weeks, the fallout spread further than I expected. Brandon took it badly. Very badly. Apparently several financial decisions had already been made based on assumptions about future ownership. I learned this indirectly. People talk. Especially when money becomes tight. The lakefront house they purchased after the wedding suddenly looked more expensive than it had a month earlier. One afternoon my accountant called. Not because there was a problem. Because there was gossip. Apparently Brandon had approached 2 different lenders seeking financing tied to projected future ownership interests. The request had not gone well. Banks tend to prefer assets that actually belong to the borrower. Around the same time, several people inside the company began quietly reaching out to me. Many wanted to apologize. That bothered me more than anything else. Not because they were disloyal. Because it reminded me how easily perception becomes reality when repeated often enough. Then came the board meeting. Technically we didn't have a traditional board. More of an advisory group. Emily attended. So did Brandon. I knew exactly why. They still believed they could influence the outcome. The meeting began normally. Then succession planning appeared on the agenda. Brandon smiled. Emily straightened in her chair. I noticed both reactions. Then I stood. For nearly 40 years I had built things. Now it was time to build clarity. I explained the updated governance structure. Then I delivered the part nobody expected. I announced that future leadership positions would not be assigned through inheritance. They would be earned through performance. The room became completely silent. I continued. Any future CEO would be selected through an independent evaluation process. Nobody would receive preferential treatment. Not even family. I looked directly at Emily. The expression on her face is something I still remember. Because for the first time, I think she understood the difference between being loved and being entitled. The meeting ended 30 minutes later. Brandon left first and Emily stayed behind. She looked like she wanted to say something. Instead she walked away. For nearly 3 months after that, we barely spoke. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. It did. Some nights I found myself sitting alone in the house wondering where exactly everything had gone wrong. Maybe when Emily was 15 and I solved the problem she should have solved herself. Maybe when she was 22 and I gave her opportunities she hadn't earned. Maybe when I confused protection with parenting. Those thoughts stayed with me. The company kept growing. The world continued doing what it always does. Then one Tuesday afternoon, almost 6 months after the wedding, my phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a while. Then I replied. Of course. We met at a small diner halfway between our houses. The place had been there for decades. When I arrived, Emily was already waiting. She looked different. The confidence she used to wear like armor had softened. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, she finally said it. I was angry. I nodded. I know. She looked down at her coffee. I spent years telling myself a story. I didn't interrupt. She continued. It was easier to blame you for what wasn't perfect than admit how much you actually gave me. That sentence hit harder than I expected. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. We talked about everything. Not every wound healed that afternoon. Some don't. Life isn't a movie. People rarely transform completely after one emotional conversation. But something important happened. For the first time in years, we spoke to each other instead of past each other. As we stood in the parking lot preparing to leave, Emily hesitated. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry about the wedding." I nodded. Yeah. She wiped at her eyes and laughed softly. I can't believe that's all you're going to say. I smiled. What else is there? She laughed again. Then I hugged her. My daughter. The little girl who lost her mother too young. We went our separate ways after that. The company remains mine today. One day someone else will run it. Maybe Emily. Maybe not. That decision belongs to the future. I've thought a lot about that wedding speech since it happened. For a while I viewed it as the worst moment of my life. Now I see it differently. It was painful. But it also forced something into the open that had been quietly growing for years. Without that speech, I might never have examined what was happening. The truth is that Emily wasn't the only one who made mistakes. I spent years teaching her that resources would appear whenever she needed them. Those lessons didn't create a bad person. They created a confused one. And confusion, left unchecked long enough, eventually turns into entitlement. And these days, when I walk through the office each morning and see employees getting to work, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time. Peace. The kind that arrives when everything important finally stands on a foundation strong enough to carry its own weight.